When an expedition disappeared into the Grand Canyon in 1909, carrying mining equipment designed for workers of impossible scale, the official explanation barely made sense. What made even less sense was why every photograph documenting what they found vanished from the historical record within 3 years. This wasn't supposed to be a mystery. Standard archival research, routine expedition documentation, nothing more. But the deeper the investigation went, the more obvious it became that something about the Grand Canyon mining operations between 1890 and 1920 has been systematically removed from accessible history. The Arizona Gazette published an article on April 5, 1909, describing an expedition led by Professor S.A. Jordan, funded by the Smithsonian Institution, discovering caves within the Grand Canyon containing artifacts suggesting a civilization of extraordinary physical development. The article detailed mining tunnels, massive doorways, and tools sized for operators far exceeding normal human proportions. That article exists in archived newspapers. What doesn't exist are the expedition photographs the article specifically references. What doesn't exist are the Smithsonian records confirming or denying the expedition ever occurred. What doesn't exist is any explanation for why documentation this detailed simply stops appearing in the historical record. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Between 1887 and 1912, newspaper accounts from Arizona, Nevada, and Southern California describe mining operations employing workers of exceptional stature, typically estimated between 8 and 10 feet tall, specifically recruited for work in deep shaft mining and heavy ore extraction. The accounts aren't vague folklore. They include specific mine names, foreman testimonials, and in some cases, photographs showing these workers standing beside standard height miners for scale comparison. Then after 1912, the documentation doesn't gradually decline, it stops. As if someone decided these particular workers were no longer appropriate to document. Here's what makes this impossible to dismiss as exaggeration or mistaken reporting. The mining equipment itself tells a different story than the official historical narrative. Surviving tools from Grand Canyon mining operations between 1890 and 1915 include pickaxes with handles approaching 7 feet in length, ore buckets requiring lifting capacity far exceeding what standard-sized workers could manage, and doorway frames and sealed mine shafts measuring 11 to 12 feet in height. These aren't decorative elements, these are functional workspace dimensions. You don't build a doorway 12 feet high in a working mine shaft unless the workers using that doorway require that clearance. The mining operations themselves present another layer of evidence that complicates the official narrative. The Grand Canyon mining claims filed between 1890 and 1920 describe vertical shafts descending to depths that would have been extraordinarily dangerous for standard height workers using technology available at that time. These weren't surface mining operations. These were deep shaft mines descending 800 to 1,200 feet into solid rock, requiring workers capable of operating under extreme physical stress while maneuvering heavy equipment in confined spaces. The official historical accounts describe these operations as typical mining ventures using conventional workers and standard equipment. The physical evidence suggests otherwise. Photographs present the most compelling documentation. The Arizona Historical Society archives contain at least 17 photographs from Grand Canyon area mining operations showing workers whose proportions relative to surrounding equipment and structures cannot be reconciled with the 6-foot average height assumed in standard historical accounts. In one photograph from a mine near Supai, a worker stands beside a standard gauge mining cart, using the cart's documented 36-inch wheel diameter as reference. The worker's height can be calculated at approximately 9 feet 2 inches. That's not estimation. That's measurement based on known equipment specifications. But here's where it gets strange. When you request access to the original prints of these photographs for detailed analysis, the archives can't locate them. The photographs exist as reproductions in historical collections, but the original prints that would allow technical authentication have been separated from their documentation and transferred to locations that remain unspecified. The pattern appears across multiple repositories. Photographic evidence exists. Original source material enabling verification has been systematically relocated to inaccessible storage. The expedition accounts describe discoveries that official archaeology refuses to investigate. The 1909 Arizona Gazette article details Professor Jordan's discovery of passages carved with precision suggesting advanced knowledge of structural engineering, doorways proportioned for occupants of extraordinary height, and artifacts indicating a population that vanished suddenly rather than gradually. The article includes specific measurements: passages 8 feet wide, doorways averaging 11 feet in height, alcoves suggesting sleeping quarters for beings approaching 9 to 10 feet tall. These aren't vague descriptions, these are documented dimensions that should have sparked extensive investigation. The Smithsonian's response to inquiries about the Jordan expedition has remained consistent since the article's publication. No records of such an expedition exist in their archives. This response appears definitive until you examine what it actually claims. The Smithsonian doesn't say the expedition never occurred. They say records don't exist in their archives. These are meaningfully different statements. Records can be lost, destroyed, transferred, or classified. The absence of records in accessible archives doesn't establish the absence of the expedition itself. The official explanation requires accepting several improbable coincidences occurring simultaneously. First, that multiple newspapers across Arizona and surrounding territories independently fabricated detailed accounts of identical phenomena using similar descriptive language and measurements despite no apparent coordination or shared source material. Second, that photographic evidence showing workers of exceptional height represents either optical illusions or deliberate forgeries, despite appearing in routine mining documentation rather than sensational publicity materials. Third, that mining equipment sized for operators of exceptional stature was constructed for standard height workers who somehow managed to operate tools approaching twice their own height. Fourth, that the systematic disappearance of documentation represents ordinary archival decay rather than deliberate removal. Each explanation in isolation might seem plausible. Together, they require more suspension of disbelief than alternative explanations. If you're beginning to see the pattern, if these questions resonate with something you've noticed in other historical gaps, consider subscribing to stay updated as this investigation continues. The documentation exists in fragments scattered across archives that don't communicate with each other. Reconstructing what happened in those canyon mines requires assembling evidence they apparently didn't expect anyone to connect. The mining industry itself provides context that makes the official narrative increasingly difficult to maintain. Between 1880 and 1920, deep shaft mining represented one of the most dangerous occupations in America, with fatality rates exceeding 40 deaths per 1,000 workers annually in some operations. The work required exceptional physical strength, the ability to operate in confined spaces under extreme stress, and the capacity to move heavy equipment and extracted ore through vertical shafts using rudimentary mechanical assistance. Standard historical accounts describe this work being performed by immigrant laborers and displaced indigenous populations. The accounts don't explain how workers averaging 5 foot 6 inches in height could perform work that engineering analysis suggests required capabilities far exceeding those populations' physical parameters. The pattern recognition phase begins with a simple observation. The documented giant miners don't appear randomly across the mining industry. They appear specifically in deep shaft operations in the southwestern territories between 1887 and 1912, concentrated particularly in Arizona and Nevada. They appear in precisely the mines where the work would have been most difficult, most dangerous, and most demanding of exceptional physical capability. Then, after 1912, they disappear from documentation completely, coinciding with major reforms in mining regulation and the consolidation of independent operations under larger corporate entities. That timing cannot be coincidental. When independent mine operators controlled operations, documentation of unusual workers appeared regularly in local newspapers, expedition reports, and company records. When corporate consolidation occurred and federal regulation increased, that documentation stopped appearing. The question isn't whether unusual workers existed in those mines. The photographic and testimonial evidence establishes they did. The question is why their existence stopped being documented after the industry reorganized under centralized control. The coordination required to suppress this documentation suggests institutional involvement beyond simple corporate discretion. Local newspapers across multiple territories simultaneously stopped publishing accounts that had appeared regularly for 25 years. Photographic archives across multiple institutions simultaneously transferred original prints to inaccessible storage while retaining reproductions of limited quality. The Smithsonian Institution simultaneously lost all records of expeditions it apparently funded and publicized through newspaper coverage. Historical societies across the Southwest simultaneously created gaps in their mining operation documentation, covering the same narrow time period. This isn't organic historical decay. This is systematic removal of specific evidence while preserving surrounding context. The mining equipment provides evidence that proves difficult to suppress, because physical objects are harder to disappear than documents and photographs. Surviving tools from southwestern mining operations of that era include specimens that cannot be explained through conventional historical models. A pickaxe recovered from a sealed Grand Canyon mine shaft in 1957 features a handle measuring 6 foot 11 inches in length, far exceeding the 4 to 5 foot handle standard for the era. The pickaxe wasn't decorative. The wear patterns on the metal head indicate extensive use in actual mining operations. Someone used that tool for its intended purpose. Someone tall enough that a 7-foot handle represented appropriate ergonomic proportion. The doorways tell a similar story. When sealed mine shafts are occasionally accessed for safety inspections or historical surveys, the proportions of working spaces contradict official narratives about who worked there. Tunnels in Grand Canyon area mines feature clearance heights averaging 10 to 11 feet, far exceeding the 7-foot maximum that would have been necessary for workers of standard height. The explanation that this extra height was for ventilation or equipment movement fails when you examine the tunnel dimensions comprehensively. The extra height isn't just vertical clearance. The doorways themselves are proportioned for beings of exceptional stature, with width to height ratios matching human proportions but scaled upward. But here's where it gets stranger. The mines where this evidence appears most consistently are the mines that were sealed and abandoned most rapidly. Mines that would normally have been worked for decades based on ore richness were sealed and classified as exhausted within years of opening. The official explanation cites economic factors, but the economic records don't support that explanation. These weren't marginal operations that failed to generate profit. These were highly productive mines that suddenly stopped operating despite continued ore availability. The pattern suggests the mines were sealed, not because they were exhausted, but because they were exposing evidence that someone didn't want exposed. When you map the sealed mines against the timeline of giant documentation disappearance, the correlation is remarkable. Mines documented as employing workers of exceptional stature were sealed between 1910 and 1920. Mines without such documentation continued operating into the 1930s and 1940s. The operational lifespan correlates not with ore availability, but with whether the mine's operation generated evidence of unusual workers. The deeper this investigation goes, the more obvious it becomes that certain questions aren't meant to be asked. The evidence exists, the documentation is fragmentary but recoverable. The pattern is consistent across multiple independent sources. But investigating this pattern systematically leads to archival dead ends, missing records, and institutional denials that what's documented in their own publications ever occurred. If you're ready to ask these questions anyway, if you're willing to examine evidence that contradicts comfortable historical narratives, subscribe to join others who refuse to accept that major aspects of recent American history have been systematically obscured. The expedition accounts describe not just unusual workers, but entire underground complexes, suggesting systematic occupation. The 1909 Arizona Gazette article details passages extending more than a mile into the canyon walls, featuring carved rooms with alcoves suggesting sleeping quarters, food storage areas proportioned for beings of exceptional size, and ventilation systems demonstrating advanced engineering knowledge. Professor Jordan's account describes one chamber measuring approximately 400 feet in length with a ceiling height approaching 30 feet, featuring carved pillars supporting the roof structure. These aren't natural formations modified for human use. These are engineered spaces carved into solid rock with precision that challenges understanding of available technology. The article quotes Jordan describing tool marks in the stone suggesting cutting rather than chiseling, as if the rock had been softened before carving. That description appears absurd until you examine carved stonework from the same era in other contexts, where similar cutting patterns appear that cannot be explained through conventional 19th century stone working techniques. The official archaeology establishment refuses to investigate these claims, citing the Arizona Gazette article as a hoax, despite its appearance in a legitimate newspaper of record that published routine expedition reporting alongside this account. The refusal to investigate doesn't cite specific evidence proving the account false. It simply dismisses the claims as implausible and therefore not worth examining. This represents a curious approach to archaeological methodology, where evidence is dismissed without investigation because it contradicts established narratives rather than investigated to determine whether established narratives require revision. The mining operations themselves demonstrate capabilities that official timelines struggle to explain. The Grand Canyon mines descended to depths approaching 1,200 feet, using technology officially described as rudimentary hoisting systems and basic excavation tools. Modern mining engineering analysis suggests that achieving those depths with available technology while maintaining worker safety would have required capabilities exceeding what standard historical accounts describe. The mines weren't just deep. They featured complex tunnel networks, ventilation systems, and structural supports, suggesting engineering knowledge more advanced than conventional narratives acknowledge. The workers who could operate in those conditions, moving tons of ore through vertical shafts using equipment that modern analysis suggests required exceptional strength, disappeared from documentation after 1912 without explanation. The mines where they worked were sealed despite continued economic viability. The photographs documenting their existence were transferred to inaccessible archives. The expedition reports describing underground complexes, proportioned for their use, were dismissed as hoaxes without investigation. The pattern of suppression is systematic enough that dismissing it as coincidence requires believing in coincidences more improbable than deliberate coordination. The question starts as curiosity about unusual mining documentation. It becomes suspicion when you notice how consistently evidence has been removed. It becomes certainty when you map the removals and realize they follow patterns suggesting institutional coordination rather than random decay. Someone decided this evidence shouldn't be accessible. Someone had the authority to make that decision across multiple independent institutions simultaneously. Someone had reasons to ensure that whatever worked in those Grand Canyon mines between 1890 and 1920 would not be documented in accessible historical records. What were they? Not metaphorically, not theoretically, but physically, documentably. What were these workers who appeared in mining operations for 25 years and then vanished from all documentation? The photographic evidence establishes they existed. The equipment specifications established they were far larger than standard human proportions. The expedition accounts established they built or occupied underground complexes, proportioned to their scale. The suppression pattern establishes that their existence became problematic enough to justify systematic removal of evidence. The official narrative offers no coherent explanation. It dismisses the photographs as misidentified or forged without providing evidence of forgery. It dismisses the newspaper accounts as sensationalism without explaining why routine mining documentation would suddenly become sensational. It dismisses the equipment as incorrectly attributed without explaining what standard height workers would need with 7-foot pickaxe handles. It dismisses the expedition accounts as hoaxes without investigating the sites described to determine whether physical evidence exists. Each dismissal in isolation might seem reasonable. Together, they reveal an unwillingness to investigate that looks less like scientific skepticism and more like motivated denial. When evidence consistently points in directions that contradict established narratives, scientific methodology demands investigation to determine whether the narratives require revision. When evidence is instead dismissed without investigation, the dismissal suggests the narratives are being protected rather than refined through accumulating evidence. The most disturbing aspect hasn't even been addressed yet. These mining operations occurred less than 150 years ago. This isn't ancient history obscured by millennia of lost records. This is recent enough that we should have comprehensive documentation, surviving equipment, photographs with verified provenance, and institutional records explaining what occurred. Instead, we have fragments suggesting a phenomenon too systematic to ignore, combined with institutional denial too coordinated to be coincidental. The timeline itself demands explanation. For 25 years, newspapers routinely document unusual workers in southwestern mines. For 25 years, mining operations employ equipment proportioned for workers of exceptional height. For 25 years, expeditions explore Grand Canyon complexes, suggesting occupation by beings larger than standard human scale. Then after 1912, the documentation stops. Not gradually, not partially, but comprehensively. As if a switch was thrown and certain types of documentation became impermissible. What happened in 1912 that made documenting these workers unacceptable? The year coincides with major corporate consolidation in mining, increased federal regulation of extractive industries, and the beginning of systematic archaeological oversight by institutions including the Smithsonian. The timing suggests that when independent operators controlled documentation, unusual phenomena were reported. When institutional control consolidated, reporting stopped. The correlation suggests institutional suppression rather than the disappearance of the phenomena itself. The Grand Canyon itself has been systematically restricted from exploration since the early 20th century. Vast sections remain closed to public access, officially for environmental protection or safety concerns. These restrictions prevent independent investigation of the sites described in expedition accounts. The caves and tunnel systems reported in the 1909 Arizona Gazette article exist in areas that have been closed to public access for over a century. Whether they contain evidence supporting those reports cannot be verified because the areas cannot be accessed for investigation. This represents a curious approach to scientific inquiry. If the expedition accounts are hoaxes, as official archaeology claims, allowing investigation would definitively prove them false and settle the matter. The refusal to allow investigation, while insisting the accounts are false, suggests the institutions restricting access are less certain about their falsity than their public dismissals indicate. You don't prevent investigation of claims you're confident are false. You prevent investigation of claims you're concerned might be true. The pattern appears everywhere once you start looking. Historical accounts describe phenomena contradicting established narratives. Physical evidence supports those accounts. Institutional authorities dismiss the accounts without investigating the evidence. Access to the locations where evidence might exist is restricted. Documentation that should exist is missing from archives or has been transferred to inaccessible storage. The pattern repeats with such consistency that explaining it through coincidence requires believing in coordinated coincidences, more improbable than coordinated suppression. If you find value in asking questions everyone else avoids, if you're beginning to recognize how systematically certain types of evidence have been removed from accessible history, consider subscribing or joining as a member to ensure these investigations continue. The archival research required to reconstruct suppressed history takes hundreds of hours examining records. Most historians never access. Your support makes it possible to continue asking the questions that institutional authorities have decided shouldn't be asked. The implications extend beyond curious historical anomalies. If beings of exceptional stature worked in southwestern mines until the early 20th century, where did they come from? Where did they go? Why does no contemporary documentation acknowledge their existence despite photographic and testimonial evidence establishing they were documented routinely until that documentation stopped. The questions multiply faster than answers, but the multiplication itself becomes evidence. When asking obvious questions about documented phenomena generates institutional denial rather than institutional investigation. The denial suggests the phenomena threaten narratives that institutions are invested in protecting. What narratives? The narrative that human history follows smooth developmental progression from primitive to advanced. The narrative that no significant capabilities or populations have been lost or hidden from historical record. The narrative that current institutional authorities possess comprehensive understanding of human history, and that challenges to their understanding represent ignorance rather than evidence they've failed to acknowledge. These narratives serve institutional authority by positioning current knowledge as complete and challengers as uninformed. Evidence of deliberately obscured populations threatens those narratives by demonstrating that current knowledge is incomplete and institutional authorities have actively suppressed evidence contradicting their claims to comprehensive understanding. The workers who mined the Grand Canyon represent one thread in a larger pattern. The oversized architecture appearing globally in the late 19th century. The photographic documentation of beings exceeding normal human scale. The expedition accounts describing evidence of previous civilizations with capabilities exceeding official technological timelines. The systematic suppression of evidence through archival gaps, institutional denial, and restricted access to investigation sites. Each thread individually might seem like curious anomaly. Together, they suggest that recent human history includes populations, capabilities, and events that have been deliberately removed from accessible historical narratives. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The pattern appears in architecture you've walked past without questioning, in historical accounts you've read without noticing what they don't explain, in institutional responses that dismiss rather than investigate, in archival gaps that appear too systematic to be accidental. The silence is deafening once you learn to hear it. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of systematic removal, where evidence existed and was documented and then disappeared from accessible records in patterns suggesting coordination rather than coincidence. The Grand Canyon mines were sealed. The photographs were relocated. The expedition records were lost or classified. The workers disappeared from documentation. The evidence was suppressed. These aren't theories, these are documented facts about how evidence was handled. The only question remaining is why evidence this systematic required such systematic suppression. What were they protecting? What did those miners represent that made documenting their existence unacceptable after 25 years of routine documentation? The official narrative has no answer, because acknowledging the question undermines the narrative's foundation. If beings of exceptional stature worked in American mines until the early 20th century, and their existence was systematically erased from historical record, what else has been erased? What other populations existed and disappeared? What other capabilities were demonstrated and suppressed? What other evidence exists in sealed archives, restricted sites, and institutional storage that contradicts the complete and comprehensive historical understanding that authorities claim to possess? These questions don't have comfortable answers. They threaten narratives that provide certainty about human history and institutional authority. They suggest that what we've been taught represents curated selection rather than comprehensive account. They imply that the gaps in historical narratives aren't accidents of lost records, but deliberate removals of evidence that contradicted stories institutions needed people to believe. Once you recognize suppression in one area, you begin to notice patterns elsewhere. The questioning doesn't stop with giant miners. It expands to everything you've been taught to accept without investigation. The evidence exists for those willing to examine it. The documentation is fragmentary but recoverable. The patterns are consistent across independent sources. The institutional responses reveal more through what they refuse to investigate than through what they claim.